This is going to show how to create a displacement map using Photopea. If you have Photoshop installed, you could follow along, but Photopea is free and it's online, so you can access all of your Photoshop stuff from anywhere that you have an internet connection. So I'm going to import the image that will be used for the displacement map. Dragging in the image file. This is beyond 1920 by 1080, so it's great to have a little extra. This way the camera could be further out and push into the scene. This is the background layer. Create a new layer. And this layer, double click on it, call it foreground or FG. Using the select polygonal tool right up here, polygonal lasso tool, carve out a selection of the foreground elements and then fill that in with white. And using the paintbrush, we're going to model it a little bit, going from grayscale to white here. Then a gradient will be used in the midground, going up to the person's feet. And then the background will be totally black. And that will create our displacement map. With this tool selected, drag out a rough selection, and that means just click and outline the rock pile. It's okay if it goes a little on the inward side. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to be smudging the edges using blur. Rounding the corners and finally clicking where I started, and that completes the selection. Fill this in with white. You can use the paint bucket, which is under here, or going under Edit, Fill, and make sure to pick the foreground color. The foreground color that I want, here's the color swatch, is white, and click OK. And that puts white in the foreground bucket of the color swatch. Pick up the paint bucket and click anywhere within the selection. The next task is to build up the edges using a little bit of gray. With the selection still active, pick up the paintbrush. Pick a slightly more gray, such as this, making sure to click OK. I'm going to increase the brush size up here. I'm going to turn down the opacity of the brush. This way, by stroking multiple times, the gray will be built up. This is the first pass. With the selection still on, this way I'm not accidentally putting gray in the image. I'll do a second pass over this. Once a Gaussian blur is applied, these rough edges between the grays will go away. And I'll do another pass over here. And this should be good enough. You can turn off the selection of the layer by pressing Ctrl D. With the layer selected, go under Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and increase the blur to get rid of the hard edges. Next is to create a grayscale template for the midground. And to do that, create a new layer. And I'm going to drag that under the foreground layer. I'm going to call it MG for midground. For this background, I'm going to paint bucket it all black by selecting black. Using the fill tool, the midground is selected and just spilling those pixels out onto the midground. I'm going to turn on rulers, Control R. Turn off this midground for a moment, just so I can put a guide down where the feet are, right there. And so this will be the gradient going from black to matching roughly the value over here. Let me turn back on this layer. Picking up the gradient tool, which is underneath the bucket tool. This is the gradient tool. From the type of gradient, instead of clicking this swatch, click the little triangle next to it and pick a predefined gradient going from black to white. This is the right one. And with this selected, click at the guideline here and drag out a little beneath the foreground. Hold down the Shift key to keep it lined up vertically, and then let go. And we're done. Save this file, Save As, and save it as a PNG file. want to move around as a preview, just drag around the viewport to see what you're about to get. Click on Save. Also save out the PSD in case you have to come back and do extra work. And now jump to After Effects to apply this effect. Here's After Effects. This is the image. Drag in the mask that you just created. And apply that right above it by dragging it from the project right above it. On the image layer, apply a displacement map. Turn off this displacement layer. For displacement map, select layer 1, which is the mask that was just dragged into the composition. For horizontal and vertical displacement, set them both to luminance. And you're ready to go. This image is a little bigger. Go wire the scale of the mask into the scale of the main image. Just like this. Selecting the pick whip of the scale of the mask and drag it to scale of the factory this way. As the factory scales, so will the mask. Create a controller to control the horizontal and vertical, and then create a little animation with all this. Create a new null object. That null lives in the center, and its position is 960 by 540, and that will come up in a moment from now. Let me break apart the values for this by right-clicking on the null object's position, separate dimensions, and the reason I'm doing that is so I could wire in the effects, horizontal and vertical displacement into the position of the controller up here. For max displacement, select the pick whip and drag it to the X position. For the max displacement along the Y axis, select its pick whip and drag it to the Y position. And everything seems exaggerated and off. And that's because the value for max displacement along the X and Y is 960 by 540 because of the initial position of the null object. To fix this, go to the max position, open up its expression, and wherever the value is here now, 960, do minus 960 to set it back to 0. The Y, do the same thing. Max vertical displacement, open it up. Currently says 540. Minus 540, and that zeroes out the values. And now we have this wonderful way to control looking around the scene using this null object. To animate all this, click on the X and Y position for the null object. Set it up wherever you want it to be. Go forward a few seconds. Let me do 4 seconds forward, which is 120 frames. And drag this null object down. And you're making sure not to do it so extreme that you see this tearing, which is a stretching of the texture pixels within After Effects.